The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete entrance of Pine Ridge Military Base as 8-year-old Lucy walked slowly toward the main gate. Her small hands gripped two precious items, an old photograph that had seen better days and a wooden box that seemed too heavy for someone her size. The photo showed a young man in military uniform, his smile bright and proud, while the box held secrets that only she and one other person truly understood. Lucy had been planning this visit for weeks. Today wasn't just any ordinary day. It marked exactly 5 years since her daddy went to heaven, and she had something very important to do. Her grandmother had driven her most of the way, but had to drop her off at the bus stop because the old car was making funny noises again. Lucy didn't mind the short walk. She was used to doing things on her own. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed how big and serious everything looked. The American flag flapped in the gentle breeze, and men and women in uniform moved about with purpose. This was where her daddy had worked before he went away to fight the bad guys. At least that's how Grandma had explained it to her when she was smaller. Officer Danny Rodriguez looked up from his morning paperwork as the little girl approached his booth. He was in his mid-30s, had been working gate security for about 3 years, and took his job very seriously. Maybe a little too seriously, some of his colleagues would say. He prided himself on following rules and keeping unauthorized people away from the base. When he saw Lucy walking toward him alone, his eyebrows furrowed with concern and suspicion. "Hey there, little one," he called out through the glass window of his security booth. "You can't be here by yourself. Where are your parents?" Lucy stopped in front of the booth and looked up at him with hopeful eyes. She had practiced what she was going to say during the entire bus ride. "Good morning, sir. My name is Lucy, and I have an appointment with Colonel Peterson today. He asked me to come at 10 o'clock. Officer Rodriguez almost laughed out loud. This kid, who couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old, was claiming to have a meeting with one of the highest-ranking officers on the base. He'd seen it all. During his time at the gate, people trying to sneak onto the base, lying about appointments, making up stories. But this was a new one. "An appointment with Colonel Peterson?" he repeated, his voice dripping with doubt. "Little girl, do you have any idea who Colonel Peterson is? He doesn't just meet with random kids who show up at the gate." Lucy nodded earnestly and held up the photograph. "Yes, sir. He knew my daddy. My daddy was a soldier here before he went to fight in the war. Colonel Peterson promised my grandma that he would meet with me today because it's a special day." Officer Rodriguez barely glanced at the photo. He'd dealt with enough troublemakers and attention seekers to know a tall tale when he heard one. This kid was probably just making up stories, maybe trying to get onto the base to play around or cause mischief. Her clothes weren't fancy, just a simple dress that looked like it had been washed many times, and shoes that had definitely seen better days. She clearly wasn't from one of the military families that lived on base. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his tone becoming more stern. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you can't just walk up here and make up stories about meeting with colonels. Military bases aren't playgrounds. If you don't have proper authorization, you need to leave right now." But Lucy didn't move. Instead, she carefully opened the wooden box just enough to show him a glimpse of what was inside. The morning sunlight caught the edge of something metallic and shiny. "These belong to my daddy," she said quietly. "Colonel Peterson said he wanted to give them to me personally because today is the anniversary of when Daddy became a hero." Officer Rodriguez leaned forward to get a better look, but quickly dismissed what he saw, probably just some toy medals or fake jewelry the kid had found somewhere. Kids were always playing dress-up and pretending to be soldiers. He'd seen it countless times when military families brought their children to base events. "Okay, that's enough," he said, standing up from his chair. "I don't know where you got those toys, but this joke has gone on long enough. You need to call someone to come pick you up, or I'm going to have to call the police to help find your family." Lucy's eyes began to fill with tears, but she blinked them back. She had promised Grandma she would be brave today, just like Daddy had been brave. "Please, sir, I'm not lying. Colonel Peterson really did invite me. He said he had something important to tell me about my daddy's last mission." Other soldiers had started to notice the commotion at the gate. A few stopped their morning routines to see what was happening. Sergeant Mike Johnson, who was heading to the commissary, walked over to see if Rodriguez needed any help. "What's going on here, Danny?" he asked, looking down at Lucy with curiosity. "Just some kid making up stories about having meetings with Colonel Peterson," Rodriguez replied loud enough for Lucy to hear. "Claims her dad was some kind of war hero or something. Probably watched too many movies and thinks she can just walk onto a military base." Sergeant Johnson chuckled and shook his head. "Kids these days have such wild imaginations, don't they? My nephew thinks he's going to be a superhero when he grows up." More personnel began to gather around, drawn by the unusual sight of a small girl at the security gate. Lucy felt their eyes on her, heard their whispered comments and quiet laughter. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she refused to give up. This was too important. "I know it sounds strange," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But my daddy really was a soldier. His name was Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, and he died 5 years ago today in Afghanistan. Colonel Peterson was his commanding officer, and he promised to meet with me when I was old enough to understand what really happened." Officer Rodriguez rolled his eyes dramatically. "Staff Sergeant Robert Chen? Never heard of him. And trust me, kid, I would know about any heroes from this base. You're getting yourself into trouble with these lies." Lucy felt her heart sinking. Why wouldn't anyone believe her? She had the photo, she had the box with Daddy's things, and she even remembered exactly what Colonel Peterson had told Grandma on the phone last week. But these grown-ups were treating her like she was just some silly child making up stories for attention. "I have his dog tags too," she said desperately, reaching into her small backpack. "And a letter that Colonel Peterson wrote to my grandma, explaining everything." But Officer Rodriguez had already made up his mind. He saw a kid from the wrong side of town, wearing clothes that had seen better days, carrying what looked like toys and props. In his experience, people who belonged on military bases looked different, acted different, came from different families. This little girl clearly didn't fit that mold. "That's it," he said firmly. "I'm calling your grandmother right now, and if you can't give me her number, I'm calling child services. You can't just wander around making up stories and bothering busy military personnel with your fantasies." The crowd of soldiers around the gate had grown larger, and Lucy could feel their judgment weighing down on her small shoulders. Some were shaking their heads in amusement, others looked annoyed at the disruption to their morning routine. But none of them seemed to believe her story, and none of them seemed to care that today was the most important day of her young life. Word about the little girl at the gate spread quickly through the base. During morning break, more soldiers began gathering around the security checkpoint, curious about what was causing such a commotion. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now turning into something much worse for Lucy. Officer Rodriguez felt proud of himself for catching what he believed was an obvious lie. In his 3 years of gate duty, he had developed what he thought was a keen eye for spotting troublemakers. To him, Lucy was just another kid trying to pull a fast one, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. "You all need to hear this," Rodriguez announced to the growing crowd of soldiers. "This little girl here claims she has a meeting with Colonel Peterson. Says her daddy was some big war hero from our base." He paused for dramatic effect, then continued with a smirk. "Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, she says. Anyone ever heard of this guy?" The soldiers looked at each other and shrugged. Pine Ridge was a large base with thousands of personnel over the years. Names came and went, and most of the current staff had only been there for a few years. Their silence seemed to confirm Rodriguez's suspicions. Corporal Lisa Martinez, who had been walking by with her morning coffee, stopped to listen. "Robert Chen? That name does sound familiar, but I can't place it. Maybe from the memorial wall?" "Memorial wall?" Rodriguez laughed. "Come on, Lisa, don't encourage her fantasies. Look at her. Does she look like she belongs to a military family? Her clothes are worn out, she's carrying around toy medals, and she probably doesn't even know what a colonel really does." Lucy's face burned with shame as more eyes turned toward her. She looked down at her dress, the same one she wore to church every Sunday, the one Grandma had carefully ironed that morning. It wasn't new or fancy, but it was clean and it was hers. She didn't understand why that mattered so much to these people. "These aren't toy medals," she said quietly, opening the wooden box a little wider. My grandma kept them safe for me until I was old enough to understand what they meant. Sergeant Johnson bent down to get a closer look, then straightened up with a dismissive wave. Kid, I've seen plenty of real military decorations in my 15 years of service. Those look like something you'd buy at a costume shop. Nice try, though. More soldiers gathered around, and Lucy felt like she was shrinking under their stares. She heard whispers and quiet laughter, saw people shaking their heads in amusement. This wasn't how she had imagined this day would go. In her mind, she had pictured walking onto the base with dignity, meeting Colonel Peterson, and finally learning the truth about how her daddy had died serving his country. I think what happened here, Rodriguez said, clearly enjoying being the center of attention, is this little girl saw some war movie and decided to create her own little fantasy. Maybe she found some old photos at a garage sale and made up this whole story about having a hero daddy. That's not true, Lucy's voice cracked as she spoke. My daddy was real, and he was brave, and he died protecting other soldiers. Colonel Peterson told my grandma everything on the phone last week. He said he had been looking for me for years, because he promised my daddy he would take care of me if something happened. The crowd exchanged glances. Some were still amused, but others were beginning to feel uncomfortable with how emotional the little girl was getting. Corporal Martinez stepped forward slightly. Honey, she said gently, if your daddy really was a soldier here, wouldn't you have some kind of military ID card or official papers? All military families get proper documentation. Lucy reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I have this letter. Colonel Peterson sent it to my grandma last week. It explains everything about today. But before she could unfold it, Rodriguez snatched it from her hands. He glanced at it briefly, then handed it back with a dismissive grunt. This is just a regular piece of paper with some typing on it. Anyone could have made this on a computer. You really think a colonel would send handwritten letters to random little girls? It's not handwritten, Lucy said, confusion evident in her voice. It's typed on official base letterhead. See the seal at the top? Rodriguez barely looked at it again. Kid, you can print anything these days. My nephew could probably make something that looks more official than this on his school computer. The watching soldiers murmured among themselves. Most of them were starting to feel sorry for Lucy, but they also trusted Rodriguez's judgment. He had been doing this job for years, and he seemed confident that this was all just a misunderstanding. Private. Kevin Walsh, who was barely 19 and new to the base, raised his hand hesitantly. Shouldn't we maybe call Colonel Peterson's office just to check if he really did schedule a meeting? I mean, what if she's telling the truth? The suggestion hung in the air for a moment before Rodriguez shot it down. Walsh, you're new. Here, so let me explain how this works. Colonels don't meet with random children who show up at the gate. They have schedules packed with important military business. They don't have time for kids with wild imaginations. Lucy felt tears starting to form in her eyes again. She blinked them back, remembering her grandmother's words from that morning. Be strong, little one. Your daddy would want you to be brave, no matter what happens. Please, she said, her voice barely audible. I know this seems crazy, but I've been waiting for this day for so long. My grandma has been preparing me for months. She taught me about Daddy's service, about the war, about why he had to go fight. She said Colonel Peterson would explain the rest when I was ready. Where is your grandmother now? Asked Sergeant Johnson. Why didn't she come with you? She's at work, Lucy replied. She cleans offices downtown in the mornings and couldn't take time off. She needs the money for our rent, but she gave me bus fare and made sure I knew exactly where to go and what to say. This detail seemed to make some of the soldiers even more skeptical. To them, a real military family would have transportation, would have proper support systems, would look different than this little girl in her simple dress carrying a worn backpack. Rodriguez crossed his arms and looked down at Lucy, with what he thought was patience, but came across as condescension. Look, sweetheart, I understand you want to feel special. Maybe you lost your real daddy and now you're trying to make up a story that makes you feel better about it. But lying isn't going to help you, and it's not going to bring him back. Plantier. Words hit Lucy like a physical blow. She clutched the wooden box tighter against her chest, feeling the weight of her father's metals inside. These weren't toys or props. They were real, they were precious, and they were all she had left of the man who used to sing her to sleep with silly songs about brave knights and beautiful princesses. "I'm not lying," she whispered, but her voice was so quiet that most of the soldiers couldn't hear her. "What was that?" Rodriguez asked mockingly. "Speak up, little storyteller. Tell us more about your imaginary war hero daddy." The crowd of soldiers had grown to about 15 people now, and Lucy felt overwhelmed by all the attention. Some looked amused, others seemed bored and ready to get back to their duties. A few appeared uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding, but none of them spoke up to defend her. She looked around at all the faces staring down at her, searching for even one person who might believe her story. But all she saw was doubt, dismissal, and in some cases, outright mockery. These were supposed to be her daddy's brothers and sisters in arms, but they were treating her like she was nothing more than a nuisance. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Lucy remained standing at the gate, refusing to leave despite the growing pressure from Officer Rodriguez and the crowd of soldiers. Her small frame seemed even tinier next to all the uniformed adults, but something deep inside her kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, her voice trembling but determined. "Colonel Peterson is expecting me at 10 o'clock, and it's only 9:30. I promised my grandma I would wait no matter what." Rodriguez was getting frustrated. What had started as a simple case of turning away an unauthorized visitor was now becoming a scene that was drawing too much attention. Other personnel walking by were stopping to stare, and he was beginning to worry that his supervisors might notice the commotion. "Listen here, little girl," he said, his voice becoming sharper. "I've been patient with you, but this has gone on long enough. You're disrupting official military business with your make-believe stories. I'm giving you one last chance to call someone to pick you up, or I'm going to have base security escort you off the property." Lucy looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and fierce determination. "My daddy used to tell my grandma that a soldier never gives up, no matter how hard things get. He said that's what makes someone a real hero, not giving up when everyone else thinks you should." Sergeant Johnson laughed and nudged the soldier next to him. "Did you hear that? Now she's quoting military philosophy. Kid's got quite an imagination, I'll give her that." But Corporal Martinez, who had been watching quietly, felt something twist in her stomach. There was something about the way Lucy spoke, about her father, that didn't sound like the words of a child making up stories. The pain in her voice seemed too real, too deep for someone her age to fake. "How did your daddy die?" Martinez asked gently, stepping closer to Lucy. Lucy's grip tightened on the wooden box. "He was protecting his friends during a really bad fight. There were bad guys shooting at them, and Daddy ran out to help save everyone. He got hurt really badly, but he made sure all his soldier friends got to safety first." The crowd fell silent. For a moment, even Rodriguez seemed taken aback by the detail and emotion in her voice. Lucy continued, her words coming faster now, as if she had been holding them in for years. "Grandma said Daddy wrote me letters before he went on his last mission. He told her that if something happened to him, I should know that he loved me more than all the stars in the sky. He said he was fighting so that little girls like me could grow up safe and free." Private Walsh, the young soldier who had suggested calling the colonel's office earlier, felt his heart skip a beat. Those words sounded familiar somehow, like something he might have heard in a memorial service or read on a plaque somewhere. "What unit was your daddy in?" he asked, ignoring the warning look from Rodriguez. "The 173rd Airborne Brigade," Lucy replied without hesitation. "He was a paratrooper. Grandma showed me pictures of him jumping out of airplanes. She said he wasn't scared of anything except leaving me behind." Several soldiers exchanged glances. The 173rd Airborne was a real unit with a proud history. It wasn't the kind of detail a child would just make up randomly. Rodriguez noticed the shift in the crowd's mood and quickly tried to regain control. "Look, anyone can look up military units on the internet these days. She probably did her research before coming here with this sob story. Don't let her fool you with a few facts she memorized." But Lucy wasn't finished. She carefully opened the wooden box a little wider, revealing not just the medals inside, but also a small stack of photographs. With trembling hands, she pulled out a picture of a young man in military uniform standing next to a helicopter. "This is my daddy on his first day in Afghanistan," she said, holding up the photo. "And this one is him with his squad right before the mission where he became a hero." She showed them another photo. Several soldiers in combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the dusty, dangerous-looking environment behind them. The man in the center bore a striking resemblance to Lucy, with the same dark eyes and determined expression. Corporal Martinez leaned in to get a better look at the photos. Something about the uniforms, the equipment, and the background looked authentic. These weren't movie stills or images downloaded from the internet. They had the grainy, personal quality of real military photographs taken in the field. "Where did you get these pictures?" she asked. "Colonel Peterson sent them to my grandma along with Daddy's things," Lucy replied. "He said Daddy would want me to see how proud he was to serve his country. He said Daddy talked about me all the time and showed these same pictures to everyone in his unit." Rodriguez was becoming more agitated by the minute. The longer this went on, the more detailed Lucy's story became, and the more some of the soldiers seemed to believe her. He couldn't let this situation spiral out of control. "Enough," he shouted, causing several people to jump. "I don't care how many fake photos you brought with you, or how many military facts you memorized. You are not authorized to be on this base, and you are not meeting with Colonel Peterson. End of discussion." He reached for his radio to call for backup, but Lucy's voice stopped him. "Please don't make me leave," she said, and for the first time tears began to roll down her cheeks. "Today is all I have left of my daddy. It's the only chance I'll ever get to understand what really happened to him. My grandma is getting old and sick, and she might not be here much longer either. If I don't do this today, I might never get another chance." The raw emotion in her voice hit the watching soldiers like a punch to the gut. Even those who had been skeptical began to feel uncomfortable with how harshly she was being treated. This was clearly a child in pain. Whether her story was true or not, Private Walsh stepped forward, his young face serious. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what if we just called Colonel Peterson's office? It would take 2 minutes and then we'd know for sure. If she's lying, we'll find out quickly. If she's telling the truth, then what?" Rodriguez snapped. "You think a colonel is going to drop everything to meet with some random kid? If her father really died serving his country, then maybe he would," Walsh replied quietly. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lucy stood in the center of it all, clutching her father's belongings, her small body shaking with the effort of holding back sobs. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. "My daddy used to say that the hardest battles aren't always fought with guns," she whispered. "Sometimes the hardest battle is just getting people to listen, to believe, to care. He said that's why soldiers fight, so that everyone's voice matters, even the smallest ones." Sergeant Johnson, who had been one of the most vocal skeptics, found himself staring at Lucy with new eyes. There was something about her dignity in the face of such harsh treatment that reminded him of soldiers he had known, people who kept going even when everything seemed hopeless. "Rodriguez," he said slowly, "maybe we should." But before he could finish his sentence, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the morning air. Everyone turned to see a black sedan with official, military plates pulling up to the gate. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying, depending on your perspective. The black sedan came to a smooth stop just 20 feet from where Lucy stood, surrounded by the crowd of soldiers. The engine's quiet hum faded into silence, and for a moment, nobody moved. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the vehicle, wondering who was inside and why they had chosen this exact moment to arrive at the gate. Officer Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. Official vehicles like this one usually meant high-ranking officers, and high-ranking officers meant the kind of people who didn't appreciate finding crowds gathered around security checkpoints during routine morning operations. He quickly tried to disperse the group. "All right, everyone, show's over," he said nervously. "Get back to your duties. Move along. Nothing to see here." But the soldiers didn't move. They were all curious to see who would step out of the sedan, and something told them this arrival wasn't a coincidence. Lucy wiped the tears from her cheeks and stood up straighter, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The driver's door opened first, and a young lieutenant stepped out. He was tall and serious-looking, with the kind of crisp uniform that suggested he worked directly with senior leadership. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the rear door with military precision. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every person present for the rest of their lives. Colonel Peterson emerged from the vehicle slowly, his every movement deliberate and dignified. He was a man in his late 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen both the best and worst of military service. His dress uniform was immaculate, with rows of ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of honorable service. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't his rank or his decorations. It was the way he looked directly at Lucy the moment his feet touched the ground. Rodriguez felt the blood drain from his face. This was actually happening. Colonel Peterson, the same Colonel Peterson he had been mocking for the past hour, was really here, and he was looking at the little girl like he knew exactly who she was. The colonel's eyes swept over the crowd of soldiers, taking in their uncomfortable expressions and guilty faces. He could read a situation like this in seconds, and it was clear that something had gone very wrong. His jaw tightened slightly, but when he looked back at Lucy, his expression softened immediately. Lucy stared up at him with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe that this moment was really happening. This was the man her grandmother had told her about, the one who had called their house and spoken in a gentle voice about her father's service. This was the person who had promised to help her understand why her daddy had to go away and never come back. Without saying a word, Colonel Peterson began walking toward Lucy. The crowd of soldiers instinctively stepped back, creating a clear path between them. The only sounds were the colonel's footsteps on the concrete and the gentle morning breeze rustling the American flag overhead. When he reached Lucy, Colonel Peterson stopped and looked down at her for a long moment. She was so much smaller than he had imagined, so young and fragile-looking. In her simple dress and worn shoes, clutching that wooden box like it contained all the treasures in the world, she looked exactly like the little girl her father had described in their late-night conversations in Afghanistan. Then, in a gesture that shocked everyone present, Colonel Peterson removed his military cap and tucked it under his left arm. His gray hair caught the morning sunlight as he straightened to his full height and brought his right hand up in a perfect military salute. The salute wasn't casual or quick. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of respect usually reserved for fallen heroes and visiting dignitaries. Colonel Peterson held the position for what felt like an eternity, his eyes never leaving Lucy's face. The silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier in the area stood frozen, trying to process what they were witnessing. Officers of Colonel Peterson's rank didn't salute children. They didn't remove their caps for civilians. They certainly didn't show this level of formal respect to little girls in worn dresses who had wandered up to the gate. But Lucy understood. Even at 8 years old, she recognized the significance of what was happening. Her father had taught her about military customs during their brief time together, and her grandmother had explained the meaning of salutes and respect in the military world. This wasn't just a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of her father's sacrifice and her own connection to that legacy. With tears streaming down her face, Lucy did something that made several of the watching soldiers wipe their own eyes. She carefully set down the wooden box, stood as straight as her small frame would allow, and returned the colonel's salute with her own tiny hand. It wasn't a perfect military salute. Her form was that of a child who had practiced in front of a mirror after watching old war movies with her grandmother, but the sincerity and respect behind it were unmistakable. For that moment, she wasn't just a little girl at a security gate. She was the daughter of a fallen hero, acknowledging the respect being shown to her father's memory. Officer Rodriguez felt like he was going to be sick. Everything Lucy had said was true. Every detail she had shared, every claim she had made, every piece of evidence she had tried to show them, it was all real. And he had spent the last hour humiliating her in front of a crowd of soldiers. Colonel Peterson finally lowered his salute and knelt down so he was at eye level with Lucy. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried clearly to everyone present. "Miss Lucy Chen," he said, and the use of her last name confirmed what everyone was beginning to realize. "I am so sorry I'm late. I got held up in a meeting and I should have been here to meet you at the gate. I hope these soldiers have been taking good care of you while you waited." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Colonel Peterson's tone was still kind, but there was steel underneath it. He had clearly figured out that Lucy's wait at the gate hadn't been pleasant, and he wanted to know exactly what had happened. Lucy looked around at the faces of the soldiers who had been mocking her just minutes earlier. She could have told Colonel Peterson everything, about the laughter, the dismissal, the way they had treated her like she was lying about her father's service. She could have gotten them all in serious trouble. Instead, she smiled through her tears and said, "They were just doing their job, sir. They didn't know who I was." The grace and maturity in her response hit the watching soldiers like a physical blow. This child, who had every right to be angry and vindictive, was protecting them from the consequences of their own behavior. She was showing them the kind of character her father must have possessed, the ability to forgive even when you've been wronged. Colonel Peterson studied her face for a moment, and Lucy had the feeling he could see right through her diplomatic answer. But he simply nodded and stood up, extending his hand to help her gather her belongings. "Well then," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made it clear this conversation wasn't over. "Shall we go inside? I have some things that belong to your father, and some stories I think you're ready to hear." As they walked toward the base entrance together, Colonel Peterson placed a protective hand on Lucy's shoulder. Behind them, the crowd of soldiers stood in stunned silence, each one grappling with the weight of what they had just witnessed and their own role in what had almost been a terrible injustice. As Colonel Peterson and Lucy walked through the base gates together, the crowd of soldiers remained frozen in place, each one processing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Officer Rodriguez stood with his mouth slightly open, his face pale, as the reality of his mistakes crashed down on him like a ton of bricks. Colonel Peterson guided Lucy to a quiet building near the main administrative offices. The walk gave him time to observe the little girl who had captured his thoughts for so many years. She was smaller than he had expected, but there was something in her posture and the way she carried herself that reminded him strongly of her father. The same quiet dignity, the same determination in the face of adversity. Once inside his private office, Colonel Peterson closed the door and gestured for Lucy to sit in the comfortable chair across from his desk. The room was filled with military memorabilia, photographs of various units and commendations from decades of service. But Lucy's eyes were drawn to one particular wall where several framed photos showed groups of soldiers in combat gear. "Your father is in some of those pictures," Colonel Peterson said gently, noticing where she was looking. "Would you like to see them?" Lucy nodded eagerly, clutching the wooden box in her lap. Colonel Peterson stood and pointed to a photo in the center of the wall. "This one was taken just 2 weeks before the mission where your daddy became a hero. He's right there, third from the left." Lucy stood on her tiptoes to get a better look. The man in the photo was definitely her father, but he looked different somehow, more serious, more focused than in the pictures her grandmother had shown her. He was surrounded by other soldiers, all of them looking confident and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. "Tell me about that day," Lucy said quietly. "Grandma said you would explain what really happened when I was old enough to understand." Colonel Peterson returned to his seat and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Your father was the bravest man I ever had the honor of serving with. On his final mission, our unit was ambushed by enemy fighters in a mountain valley. We were outnumbered and pinned down, with no way to call for help, because our communications were damaged." Lucy listened intently, her young face serious as she tried to picture the scene her father had faced. "The enemy had us trapped in a bad position," the colonel continued. "Several of our soldiers were wounded and couldn't move to safety. Most men would have stayed in cover and waited for backup. But not your father. He looked at those injured soldiers and made a decision that changed everything." The colonel paused, his eyes distant as he remembered that terrible and heroic day. "He told me he was thinking about you, Lucy. He said he had a little girl back home who needed to grow up in a world where good people protect each other." Then he grabbed a medical kit and ran out into the open, directly into enemy fire to reach our wounded teammates. Lucy felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. She had waited 5 years to hear this story, and she needed to know every detail. Your father saved 4 soldiers that day. He carried them one by one to safety, making 4 separate trips across that dangerous open ground. The enemy was shooting at him the entire time, but he never gave up. On his final trip, he was hit, but he still managed to get the last wounded soldier to cover before. Colonel Peterson's voice trailed off, and Lucy understood without him having to say the words. Before he went to heaven, she finished softly. Yes. The colonel nodded. But because of his actions, 4 families didn't lose their fathers that day. 4 soldiers came home to their children. Your daddy's sacrifice meant that other little girls got to keep their daddies. Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Is that why you wanted to meet with me today? Partly, Colonel Peterson replied. But there's more. Your father did something else that day. Right before the final mission, he asked me to make him a promise. He said if anything happened to him, I should find his daughter when she was old enough and give her something very important. The colonel walked to a safe in the corner of his office and entered a combination. When he opened it, he pulled out an official-looking folder in a small velvet case. He returned to his desk and placed both items in front of Lucy. First, he said, opening the folder, these are your father's official military records and commendations. He was awarded the Silver Star for exceptional bravery under fire. That's one of the highest honors a soldier can receive. Lucy looked at the official documents, not understanding all the military language but recognizing her father's name and photo on several of them. And this, Colonel Peterson said, opening the velvet case, is something even more special. Inside the case was a simple gold pendant on a chain. It wasn't fancy or expensive looking, but Lucy could tell it meant something important. Your father wore this every day he was deployed, the colonel explained. He said it was his good luck charm because it had your baby picture inside. He wanted you to have it when you were old enough to understand how much you meant to him. With trembling fingers, Lucy opened the tiny locket. Inside was a picture of herself as a toddler, so small she could barely remember being that young. On the other side was an engraving that read, "For my little hero, love Daddy." The sight of her father's final gift broke down the wall of composure Lucy had been trying to maintain. She began to cry, not the angry tears of frustration she had shed at the gate, but tears of love, loss, and finally understanding her place in her father's story. Colonel Peterson came around the desk and knelt beside her chair. Your father wanted you to know that everything he did for you. He carried your picture into battle because it reminded him what he was fighting for. He made the ultimate sacrifice because he believed in creating a better world for children like you. Meanwhile, back at the security gate, Officer Rodriguez was struggling with his own emotions. The other soldiers had gradually dispersed, returning to their duties with heavy hearts and guilty consciences. But Rodriguez couldn't move. He kept replaying the morning's events in his mind, hearing his own mocking words echoing in his memory. Sergeant Johnson approached him quietly. Danny, you couldn't have known. Yes, I could have, Rodriguez replied, his voice hollow. I could have made one phone call. I could have shown her basic human decency instead of assuming the worst. I could have listened instead of judging. Private Walsh, who had tried to suggest calling the colonel's office, walked over to join them. What are you going to do now? Rodriguez looked toward the building where Colonel Peterson and Lucy had disappeared. I'm going to wait for them to come out, and then I'm going to apologize to that little girl. And then I'm going to request a transfer to a position where my prejudices can't hurt innocent people. An hour later, Colonel Peterson and Lucy emerged from the building. Lucy was wearing her father's pendant around her neck, and she carried a new folder containing copies of all his military records. But more importantly, she carried the knowledge of who her father really was and why his sacrifice mattered. As they walked back toward the gate, Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. His hands were shaking slightly as he approached Lucy. Miss, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I was wrong about everything, and I'm sorry I didn't believe you. Your father would be proud of how brave you were today, standing up for his memory even when nobody would listen. Lucy looked up at him for a long moment. then smiled with the same forgiveness she had shown earlier. It's okay. My daddy always said that good people make mistakes sometimes, but what matters is learning from them. Officer Rodriguez felt tears in his own eyes as this remarkable child offered him grace he didn't deserve. Thank you, he managed to say. As Colonel Peterson's driver took Lucy home to share her father's story with her grandmother, the soldiers at Pine Ridge Base were left with a lesson they would never forget: that heroes come in all sizes, that dignity isn't determined by wealth or status, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by the smallest warriors who refuse to give up on what's right.